Your wallet might have already started to notice the impending cost of living crisis, with the cost of many essential goods expected to rise in coming months. So we thought we'd cover it in this video, split into 3 parts. Firstly, we're going to define the cost of living crisis. Secondly, we're going to take a look at how bad the crisis currently is, and how bad it's expected to get. And then thirdly, we're going to take a look at the political implications, and how it will affect the government's electoral fortunes. Before we get going though, if you want to be updated on stories like this going forward, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. Thanks for your support. So what exactly do we mean when we say we're going to be talking about the cost of living crisis? Well, usually when people talk about the cost of living crisis, they're referring to 3 separate phenomena: high inflation, the hike in gas prices, and the high tax burden. Now, all of these are serious factors, because according to the latest ONS data from December, the UK inflation rate is currently at a 30-year high of 5.4%, and the average gas bill is expected to rise by 54%, or £693, when the new energy price cap comes in April. Similarly, thanks to the incoming health and social care levy, the UK tax burden is set to hit its highest levels since the 1960s. These things combined are going to make living significantly more expensive, hence the cost of living crisis. So you've got higher prices and higher taxes, but this doesn't quite explain why today's situation constitutes a crisis. For the purposes of this video, we're going to assume that a crisis involves at least some people's well-being levels falling below an acceptable minimum. And, well, at least according to this definition, rising prices and rising taxes aren't a sufficient condition for a crisis. For starters, rising prices aren't bad news for everyone. Employers usually do pretty well out of rising prices, because profits usually rise in line with inflation. Asset-rich people with money in stocks also do quite well, for essentially the same reason. Rather, when we talk about inflation-induced crises, we're normally talking about employees and pensioners who are paying more tax and struggling to afford rising prices. But again, it's worth observing that rising prices aren't always bad news for employees. They're only bad news if employees' wages don't keep pace. So, if wages rose ahead of inflation, then the cost of living, as measured by so-called real inflation, would actually fall. Similarly, if wages were already high, that wouldn't be as much of an issue either. If rich people had to pay more to heat their indoor pools, well, it might be a bit annoying for them. Again, we probably wouldn't describe it as a crisis. A crisis, by definition, presumably requires people to be forced into making decisions which threaten their standards of living. And unfortunately, since 2008, real wages have stagnated, which means people are very much going to be forced into this position. To give you a sense of how bad things are, consider that by May 2024, real wages will have grown by just 2.4% since 2008. In the 16 years prior, between 1992 and 2008, they rose by 38%. But while this combination of increased living costs and stagnant wages definitely makes a crisis more likely, it's still not a sufficient condition. For example, a more generous welfare safety net could keep everyone's well-being above our acceptable minimum. And that's sort of what the welfare state's for, making sure that people don't slip below an acceptable minimum. But much like wages, unfortunately welfare spending in the UK has stagnated. According to ONS data, real-term spending per household has actually fallen since 2014, and is expected to stay beneath its 2014 peak for the foreseeable future. The point we're trying to make is that the current crisis isn't just about the recent uptick in gas prices or inflation. Rather, it's also about long-term wage stagnation in the UK, the shrinking of the welfare state, and the wider weaknesses of the UK economy. So how bad is this crisis going to get? Well, unsurprisingly, it's going to hit the poorest hardest. The poorest will be the ones most affected by the incoming energy price hike. And while both lower and upper income households will experience similar increases in their household budgets at 5.3 and 5.5% respectively, inflation for upper income households will largely be driven by higher prices for furniture, recreational activities, and eating out, while inflation for lower income households will be driven by increases in housing and energy costs. But even now, 2 months before the energy price cap hike, and a year before the new tax rises, the poorest households are already feeling the strain. According to the ONS, about 20% of UK adults have already cut back their energy usage. And according to data from the Food Foundation think tank, the bottom 20% of households are currently facing a heat or eat dilemma, cutting back on the quality or quantity of food to pay energy and other essential bills. And the bottom 10% have already experienced some degree of food insecurity over the past month, defined as skipping meals, going hungry, or not eating for a whole day because they were unable to afford it. And this does feel like a crisis-level situation. In a modern economy, having to choose between heating and eating could more than plausibly be described as falling below a minimum level of well-being. And while the poorest will be the hardest hit, middle-income households will also be affected. The Bank of England estimates that the median household income will fall by £1,000 in real terms over the next year, and that 59% of all UK households can expect to be able to spend less on food in the future. So you get the point. The cost of living crisis is already here, and it's only going to get worse. Now, as to how long the crisis will last, well, no one really knows, but probably longer than you'd think. The government's proposed tax rises will probably be in place until at least the next general election in 2023, and the government currently doesn't have the fiscal leeway to make any tax cuts. When it comes to inflation, economists disagree about whether today's inflation should be characterised as transitory or permanent, but it's nonetheless true to say that inflation has persisted longer than many analysts expected it to, and it's definitely possible that it will continue into the future. The Bank of England expects inflation to peak at 7% in spring 2022, and only expects it to return to its pre-pandemic level target of 2% in 2024. Energy prices are a similar story. Currently, markets expect prices to stay relatively high. UK gas futures, which are basically the prices that gas suppliers pay for energy deliveries in the future, are at about 200 pence per therm, significantly down from their December high of about 350, but well above the long-term average of about 60 pence per therm. Obviously, things could also get a lot worse if Russia decides to invade Ukraine, which would probably result in no more Russian gas coming to Europe, and therefore even higher gas prices. As a last thing though, it's worth discussing the political implications of this crisis. Cost of living crises are never good for incumbent governments. People don't like prices going up, and people really don't like being forced to choose between heating and eating. The government has tried to soften the blow. There's the £150 council tax rebate for all properties in the lowest 4 tax bands in England, and the £200 discount that everyone's going to get on their energy bills, although that does have to be paid back in £40 instalments over the next 5 years. And the thing is that these measures will only do so much, given that, as we mentioned earlier, the Bank of England expects the average household to lose out on about £1,000 in real terms this year, significantly more than the amount the government's offering. It's worth saying that this current crisis will be particularly politically difficult for the government because of their levelling up agenda, which is supposed to involve upgrading the poorer, less productive regions of the UK. For reasons mentioned earlier, the cost of living crisis will disproportionately hurt poor people, who tend to live in these poorer regions. This means that the cost of living crisis will probably exacerbate pre-existing regional inequality, making levelling up even more difficult. In this context, the government's Levelling Up Fund, which paid out the equivalent of just £32 per person for the north of England in 2021, looks woefully inadequate. This isn't us having a go at the government, by the way. Rather, we're saying that the government's own spending plans are inconsistent with its levelling up agenda. In other words, if the government really wants to pursue its levelling up agenda through the cost of living crisis, it's going to need to spend a lot more money. So, the long and short of it is that the cost of living crisis isn't just about the recent hikes in inflation and tax rates. Rather, it's a symptom of long-term structural weakness in the UK economy. Which is why, if the government really wants the UK to be better off at the end of it, and wants to be able to claim that they successfully levelled up, they're going to need to do a lot more. But what do you think happens next? Will the government be able to solve this cost of living crisis? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.